Well, welcome everyone again. My name is Ken Long. I am from the Adelaide Sustainable Building Network, and alongside our collaborators at the National Building Products Coalition, we're very honored to be able to host this webinar with them. I'd like to bring in Beata Davey from the Australian Institute of Architects, and we'll let her take us through the rest of the proceedings. Thank you so much, Beata.
Thank you, Ken, and welcome everyone. Today's webinar will review the Traceability and Digitalisation of Building Product Information Implementation Guide for the Australian construction industry, developed by the National Building Products Coalition, or NBPC for short. The NBPC is an industry alliance established to advance the implementation of the National Building Product Assurance Framework, or the framework, which forms part of the response to the Building Confidence Report developed by the Australian Building Codes Board at the direction of the building ministers. The NBPC guide is designed to be used by building product manufacturers, suppliers, and building practitioners to implement digital traceability systems that provide unambiguous information regarding the identity, origin, transformation, location, and attributes of building products. This guide will be particularly helpful for designers who specify products to help with information systems that enable more certain checking of provenance, evidence of suitability, and other information necessary to select compliant and fit-for-purpose building products. It provides the foundational elements to be used to implement digital traceability along the entire construction supply chain and across all product types. In doing so, it links a product with information on its safe and reliable use. The traceability of products in projects will also assist sustainability and net zero opportunities as we look to have greater transparency in building material performance, carbon emissions, and potential for circular economy reuse. It is worth noting that the ABCB has an open consultation on a proposed risk-based building product registration scheme. We encourage you all to review this draft scheme and provide submission responses either via your membership organisations or individually. In today's session, we will hear from three speakers, Neil Savory, Diane Johnson, and Dr. Andrew Wheeler, on product conformity and the role of digital traceability. This will be followed by a panel discussion where the three speakers will be joined by two additional panellists, Adam Lee and Chris Knierim. The panel will respond to questions collated throughout the event from all of you, the attendees. So please lodge your questions via the chat functions throughout the presentations. It is now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Neil Savory. Neil is the Managing Director of ICC Oceania, an arm of the US-based International Code Council, which develops the model I-codes, promotes building safety, and provides practical solutions for practitioners who work in the building sector. As part of this and other associated international collaborations, he's involved in policy subjects such as building safety, embodied carbon, life cycle assessments, modern methods of construction, digital product traceability, and building resilience. Prior to this, Neil was the Chief Executive of the Australian Building Codes Board for 9 years, having been a board member for 11. As part of this role, Neil oversaw the development of the Building Confidence Report National Implementation Framework, which included development of the National Product Assurance Framework. There are a number of national and international drivers of change that will impact on the expected performance of buildings and building products into the future. These extend beyond the traditional requirements of building safety in respect to fire and structure, and are reflected in policy settings that respond to societal expectations. The first presentation will provide an overview of the trends and possible directions for change that will have a bearing on the increasing importance of digital product traceability and the testing, inspection, and conformance infrastructure that will need to sit behind it. Thank you, and over to you, Neil.
Thank you, Beata. The introduction that Beata's given has indicated that there's a lot of things happening at both national and international levels. So this presentation aims to go through both of those. And at some point, there is a convergence of these streams of influence, particularly around the environmental performance of building products, which is obviously the focus of the digital traceability paper that Di will be introducing to you in a moment. So the domestic influences date back to around 2014. Obviously, there have been building product issues long before that, but the La Crosse apartment fire, which everyone will be familiar with, did shine a spotlight on building products, amongst other things. We then had issues around infinity cables, excessive lead in water supply and other events, which all added to this notion that Australia was being flooded with non-conforming building products. As a result of that, there was a Senate inquiry into non-conforming building products, which ended up with 3 separate reports. And during that inquiry, the Grenfell Tower fire took place, and there were other international cladding fires. And then we had high-profile defects such as Opal Tower, Mascot Tower in Sydney, which put building safety at a whole new level of national public consciousness. I can speak with a degree of reflection on this particular period when, prior to these events, building ministers really didn't have that much interest in what was happening at a national level with building control. They were more focused on their own state and territory issues. But these sequence events really did put a spotlight on these particular issues. Then we had the Building Confidence Report, which was commissioned and released in 2019 as a result of building ministers concurring that there was a need to look at what were the systemic problems within the building systems. So that wasn't just focused on building products, but there was one recommendation, 21, which related specifically to whether or not there should be a national mandatory product certification scheme for high-risk building products. So the ABCB was directed to develop a Building Confidence Report national implementation framework. And as a result, the ABCB produced a range of model guidance by the end of 2021, which included the development of a national product assurance framework. So within that assurance framework, the key sort of driver was to develop a nationally consistent and coordinated system of building product assurance and regulation to ensure that building products are manufactured, supplied and utilised in compliance and conformance with the laws, codes, standards to deliver trustworthy buildings. Now, that's not to say that there weren't and aren't measures in place, both within the code and at a state and territory level, to address issues around building products. But it wasn't as structured as many felt it needed to be, and also it was felt that it was out of date, no longer fit for purpose. And so the framework had 5 areas of focus, which are listed there. And the National Building Products Coalition has already produced a paper on evidence of suitability requirements, a proposal for change to the National Construction Code. Information requirements, product traceability, which of course is the focus of this presentation. Improved surveillance, research and information sharing, and strengthen compliance and enforcement. Now, very recently, June of this year, building ministers agreed to consider a national scheme supporting the safety and reliability of building products. So in effect, more than 2 years have transpired since the outputs of the National Building Product Assurance Framework were presented to ministers. And there's been subsequent work undertaken by Bronwyn Weir, commissioned by senior officials, which was delivered in April of this year to address implementation of the National Building Product Assurance Framework. And it's on the back of that that the ministers made the announcement. And the purpose is to help industry and consumers understand whether the products they are choosing or installing are safe and fit for purpose. Now, I mean, it's a motherhood statement. It reflects what we would expect of the current system. But as I said, the current system was deemed in 2021 not to be fit for purpose. So further work has been undertaken, but we're still some way from actually progressing with implementation. I think it's important to note also that throughout all of these events, and particularly since the Senate inquiry, there has been a distinction between the non-conforming use of products or products that don't conform with the requirements of the National Construction Code, which are deemed to be products that are fraudulent, where it's deliberate and deceptive conduct through falsification of evidence that these products are being presented as if they conform with the scheme, but they actually don't, as opposed to products that have been used incorrectly, whether that's deliberately or accidentally, which is the non-compliant use of products. The outcome is that when buildings are constructed either with non-conforming products or with non-compliant use of products, it means they don't comply with the scheme. So the draft national scheme, this is very hot off the press. This the ABCB's just released the discussion paper that Beata referred to. It's open until the 3rd of October. It's available on the ABCB website, and it's titled Proposed Risk-Based Building Product Registration Scheme. And it comprises 4 elements: to require more, better and traceable product information, introduce a risk-based designated building products category, establish a national building products register and minimise duplication and ensure scheme sustainability. Those of you who are familiar with product certification schemes, code mark, watermark, proprietary schemes, industry-run schemes, I think it's fair to say from my initial look at the document that this is not a scheme that necessarily blends with what you might be familiar with. It's more a product registration scheme or system. It's a database of information with additional bells and whistles around traceability of products, labeling of products, information requirements for products, done in a template format that has to be then placed on a national register that has public access rights. So I think it's important to look at this document to understand exactly what is being proposed. Aspects of the A5G3 evidence of suitability provisions are raised, but it's not a wholesale review of the NCC's evidence of suitability provisions, as well as there's reference to a national approach to off-site construction. That's in the context that off-site construction may be regarded as a designated building product, but that needs to be fleshed out in a lot more detail. It's also worth remembering at a domestic level that another key influence that's impacting on product assurance is not national legislation, but increasingly state and territory legislation led by Queensland, New South Wales in 2025, relating to chain of responsibility legislation, which means that everyone in the supply chain from the manufacturer through to the installer can be held accountable where product is non-compliant or doesn't conform with the requirements of the scheme. Now, I include this slide just to enable everyone to reflect on where building products sit in the context of the building safety regulatory ecosystem. So we have legislation, and the legislation may, as I've just said, chain of responsibility legislation, have an influence on products. The National Construction Code has an influence on product requirements. Standards, be they Australian standards or international standards, can impact on evidence of suitability. And then you have product compliance. Within product compliance, depending on what form of evidence is being used, there's testing, inspection, product certification, accreditation of the cabs, and the list goes on. And the practitioners, and I believe that is mainly the composition of today's audience, obviously have a significant interface with this building regulatory ecosystem. International influences. Now, this is where things start to change in scopes quite significantly. This is not to say that at an international level, the codes and standards of other countries don't have similar bearing on matters of product conformance to do with fire safety, structural reliability, weatherproofing, waterproofing, those kinds of things. But there's been a significant shift in the last few years around things like the European Green Deal for low emission technologies to achieve climate neutrality, the EU Eco Design for Sustainable Products Directive to improve EU products circularity, energy performance. And then outside of the EU, even though this includes the Australia, also in the UK, New Zealand and other jurisdictions are introducing or have introduced environmental, social and governance legislation, which is placing reporting responsibilities on companies, and in the context of products, particularly around issues of embodied carbon, whole of life, assessment of buildings, and issues to do with modern slavery. And as a result of that, the UN has been working on a transparency protocol, which has been delivered. And within that, there are matters to look at countering greenwashing by implementing supply chain traceability and transparency at scale. At the Global Buildings and Climate Forum in March of this year in Paris, there was a ministerial declaration, endorsed by 69 countries that did include Australia. It's non-binding, but the commitment is to address greenhouse gas emissions and improving resilience in the built environment. And you can see there that there are a number of trends that were recognised within the declaration. So these were taken as facts by the ministers or the ministers' representatives, that the building and construction sector is responsible for a majority of energy demand. When we look across all the sectors of the economy, the building sector is a major contributor to energy demand and the production of greenhouse gas emissions. Over the past decades, building have increasingly faced exposure to climate-related hazards as a result of global warming. The world's raw materials demand is projected to nearly double by 2060, with construction materials set to dominate, and over 100 billion tonnes of waste are annually generated from construction and demolition. So there was a forum acknowledgement, and I won't go through this list, but I've highlighted materials because of the subject of this event. And materials were recognised that there was a need to move to low carbon, energy efficient and recyclable products. So where there's now an alignment between the international and domestic is that based on current projections, as a greater proportion of building stock becomes increasingly energy efficient, there will be a significant shift in the source of GHG emissions in the sector from operational to embodied carbon. In June, as I've mentioned, Australian building ministers not only agreed to the national scheme being explored by the ABCB, but they agreed to include a voluntary pathway in NBPC 2025 for commercial buildings to measure and report on embodied carbon utilising the NABERS method, and for embodied carbon in NCC 2028 to support the transition to net zero. As to what that standard might be, it hasn't even been considered yet. And then there's federal ESG corporate reporting requirements, which will also place obligations on a range of companies to capture information. And in the future, in my opinion, will conceivably set targets. I'm sure everyone online is familiar with the carbon life cycle for buildings, but what we now have as a result of these domestic and international influences is a scope that goes well beyond what we've been doing for the past 20 odd years, which is focused on energy efficiency and the thermal comfort of buildings, right the way through the supply chain. That is the production of products and what's going into products in terms of their carbon emissions, transportation of products, etc., right through to the recovery, repurposing, not only of the products, but buildings themselves, and the energy that's used throughout the entirety of that exercise. The last part of my presentation then relates to the tools that are needed to support this. So we've got governments at an international and national level setting policy directions, involving regulators and code writing bodies and standards writing bodies in developing the infrastructure that will determine what the requirements are that manufacturers, designers, builders have to produce in their buildings and their products. But what are the tools that are going to help support them? And there was already a reference to neighbours being one of those. But as part of this, the UNECE, the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, working as a subset of the UN Transparency Protocol, has developed a white paper and a business requirement specification for digital product conformity certificate exchange. And this is all a lead into digital product traceability. The role of testing, inspection and certification will be quite critical in all of this. Conformity assessment bodies will play an increasing role in verifying documentation, in verifying the claims that are being made by product manufacturers, so that when the products are actually delivered through the supply chain with all of their documentation, there can be greater trust and the ability to check through the supply chain that the claims that are being made are accurate, and that there are digital documents in the supply chain accompanying the products the whole way through, so that whoever is interrogating or has a need to interrogate the documentation can do so without having to find paper-based versions of those documents. But paper may well still continue to be an accompaniment of products for a long period of time to come. And what we also have to guard against, obviously, is the vulnerability of any system to false connections, effectively cyber security issues, and that as a result of a single piece of commercially sensitive data, that doesn't remove the entirety of the attestation from the pool of available data. So this diagram, which is extracted from that document, is a summary of all the players involved. Sitting at the centre of this is conformity credential certification. Now, at the moment, evidence of suitability in the National Construction Code doesn't mandate conformity assessment for every form of evidence of suitability, but it is incumbent, and it will become increasingly incumbent upon the specifiers and the procurers of products to check the attestations that are being made and the claims that are being made by the product manufacturers and the product suppliers, not just for the traditional forms of evidence around product safety and reliability, but also these environmental claims when the legislation starts to set the targets. And of course, it's happening voluntarily now. International Building Quality Centre produced a paper on building product performance, good practice regulatory framework. And in amongst 31 elements, there are elements relating to product traceability. These are them. So at a minimum, all products used in a building that perform a health and safety function or have been the subject of a high risk assessment must have documentation digitally provided. So there's some alignment between that and what the ABCB is talking about in terms of designated products. But the other concept, which has international recognition already, is around digital product conformance, passports and traceability technology that allows a practitioner to verify a product's certification credentials, i.e. a golden thread of information, and ease of verifying a product's provenance throughout its supply to site and installation. So Herald digital product passports, these are being introduced in Europe. I'll go through this very quickly in a couple of other slides, but a well-designed DPP can unify information, and I think that's one of the critical aspects of all of this. It's about providing evidence and reliable evidence to other people in the supply chain through a reliable method. At this stage, the digital product passport's being kept relatively simple, but when they become more and more sophisticated, there's going to be a need to have metrics. What are the products being judged against? One example is an ICC ASHRAE standard that's being developed for embodied carbon, quantification of embodied carbon. RICS has developed a similar sort of standard. So there are multiple organisations working on ensuring that not only do you have sort of the front-facing document, but you have the tools behind the documents to enable measurement to be done in a standardized, consistent format. So the European DPPs, meant to be introduced in mid-2024, they are running behind. They're still doing proof of concept, but effectively it's similar in concept to any kind of passport that you would think of, obviously your personal passport. But this is focused very much on enabling product circularity and verified carbon neutrality. That's its primary emphasis. And building products are going to be captured in 2027 if they stick to their current timeframe through the construction products register. And you can familiarize yourself there with products that you may use or specify in your day-to-day lives. And fire and dangerous substance and environmental sustainability are kind of captured as key features or objectives. So there's a growing global use of EPDs because EPDs are a way of determining and verifying the claims of manufacturers that can then be reflected in the digital product passport. So the digital product passport is not the mechanism that determines what the claims are and how you measure the claims. It's the front-facing document in which you make your claims. So EPDs are the tool that will actually assist you in doing this. They're already being used to demonstrate and verify compliance under green building programs, public procurement, low carbon requirements, carbon reduction policies in local jurisdictions, and for ESG claims. So as they become more mainstream, they will need to be traceable with products. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with what EPDs are about, but this slide just endeavours to summarise that. EPDs are a function of accredited conformity assessment bodies being program operators. As program operators, they can develop product category rules. There are a lot of product category rules already established for construction products. And then EPD verifiers produce EPDs that are based on manufacturers' claims. So they're verifying the claims of the manufacturers to the product category rules, and then they're deposited in a register of those products and product category rules. So that's the introduction to product traceability in terms of the national and international influences that make this subject more important. Thank you, Beata.
Thank you, Neil. I will take this opportunity to introduce our second speaker today, who is Diane Johnson. An urban planner and policy manager, Diane drives the policy and advocacy agenda for Master Builders Queensland, with the challenge of building confidence and building quality central to the agenda. She works on building regulation reform both in Queensland and nationally, having served as a member of the Australian Building Codes Board's BCR implementation team, formed to implement the recommendations of the Shergold-Weir Building Confidence Report. Her role within the team led to the production of the National Building Product Assurance Framework. She now works within an industry alliance, the National Building Products Coalition, seeking to see the framework implemented for more certainty and sustainability in building product supply and use. Diane's presentation is a deep dive on traceability, focusing on the implementation guide for the Australian construction industry. Thank you, and handing over to you, Diane.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me here today and for organising this. It's great to get the word out of what we've been working on as a coalition for about 2 years now. We've been working. Who is the coalition? So we're an industry alliance. As Neil went through, there was the National Building Products, the Shergold-Weir report, produced the National Building Products Assurance Framework. I won't recap into all that. And that came out with 5 recommendations, and a group of us in industry really wanted to see these get implemented and go forward. We were feeling increasingly frustrated with the slow rate of change. So we came together, and in that time we've grown. So we are a group of not just from both sides of industry. I like to view it. We've got the manufacturers and suppliers from that side of industry. We often get labelled as industry, but manufacturers and suppliers, and then building practitioners, the designers, builders, certifiers, building surveyors, are two very different sides of industry with very different needs. And then also working in with that, we have those who look to material specification and that conformance infrastructure that Neil was also talking about, CSIRO, NADA, JASANS, and the GS1s, the standards bodies that have helped us through. So I'd like to think that we've got all the brains in the room. We cover the full gamut, and we do have an amazing depth and breadth of knowledge across those organisations that has really come together in a really powerful way. So, yeah, as I said, we've come together to see if we can help collectively implement the national building product. Not that we can implement, but we can drive the implementation and push it forward of the product assurance framework. We have come together because of product assurance and being able to use the safe and compliant use of products. But increasingly, we see that our role is about that. How do we improve productivity? How do we address the environmental and social needs of our buildings going forward? That we have some really big challenges there, that better product information and better use of products can help to address that as well. The product assurance framework is about, and Neil covered this, so I'll just be quick, is about, but for context, the 5 elements. We started off with element 1, how can we improve the evidence of suitability in the NCC? We felt that that there needed to be different levels of rigour, and that there needed to be increased rigour, and also that consistency of information that you get. So our first order off the rank was to write a proposal for change to the current draft of NCC for NCC 2025. Fortunately, it did not make the cut, but it is still in consideration for the ABCB, and that is still very much a priority and piece of work for the coalition, is to how can we get the evidence of suitability changed, which we think all these things really need to hang together and work together. But what I want to talk to you about today is the product traceability and identification work that we did under element 3, though all 5 elements really do have to hang together and work together. The drivers for change, and again, this is what Neil covered very well and in depth. But I just want to highlight that this is very much our focus in doing our work. These are the things that we were very mindful of and the problems that we were seeking to solve, if you like. And our traceability paper goes into this in great length. But what I would highlight, that I think was one that Neil missed, is the corporate reporting that is due to kick off in January next year for large corporations, and how that they can report their embodied carbon or their climate impacts. And we can see that that's going to have a significant change on how companies and their whole supply chains, of which we probably all sit within, are able to provide evidence of how the building products and buildings perform and meet various metrics under the climate risk reporting. And then same with the international trade, that there is so much happening in the international trade space. And of course, our building product, while we can be in construction, can be very focused on our local patch, building products and building product manufacturers really do operate in a global environment, and will be very driven by a lot of these initiatives with digital product passports and things like that are happening in Europe. So what is traceability, and what were we trying to do with digital traceability? Traceability is about the ability to trace the history of the application, location and source of a material or product, both backward and forward through the supply chain. So what we're looking at here is the whole supply chain, going from the initial product development, and as I was saying, the product manufacturer supply side of the industry, and then taking that through over to our side of the industry of design and construct. but then keeping the information going through to the use of the building and the operation and maintenance of that building. And ideally and increasingly, we're going to need to be thinking about how you then loop that back through the supply chain back into a more circular economy, which might be more of a dotted line at this stage, but we'll need to come to terms with sooner rather than later. So then taking that to traceability and to take it to digital traceability, of course, is something that then uses technology to be able to track that product and its associated information as it moves through the supply chain. What's really important and empowering for traceability is how it can attach the information and a product's attributes to the product as it moves through the supply chain. So your QR code, say, that can take you directly through to what is that, the digital product passport was the term, that front face that the Europeans are using, by whatever name, of how you can access the information on that product and know both at a high level that it's what the product is, where it's come from, who's provided it, who's manufactured it, but also there's attributes, that really important conformance data of what's its testing, inspection and certification. Can you trust that product? Can you specify that product and then trust to install it in your building? Do you have all the evidence? So for the construction industry, and this is the powerful thing in digital traceability, I believe, for our side of the industry, is that it provides the ability to attach that product attribute data, which is what we're trying to show in the graphic on the second half down here, the physical transaction data of where it's come and gone, but also the attribute data, how that's attached to the product as it goes through the supply chain, and that you get that information at the point of supply or specification ahead of where we currently get it, where you're kind of trying to play catch up to make sure that you've done the right thing. It's coming there at the front end. And then on to the completed building in an ideal world, and the increasing need for building manuals and being able to provide information through to building manuals that all flows through. So the benefits of traceability, there's a lot of benefits across that whole supply chain. We're talking about for manufacturers and suppliers. I don't know if you guys have all heard of the LG recall at the moment. I know I got another thing in the mail again today. It's constantly on the radio. LG is recalling some solar panels and batteries. They have no idea where this has gone out into the market. It is costing them an absolute fortune to try to recall this. We had the same with Infinity Cable. In the end, Woolworths, the owner of Masters Hardware, they've had to give up. They've just had to hope that it doesn't cause any problems out in the world. The Infinity Cable has never been tracked. So being able to do those targeted recalls when needed, but also improve their manufacturing processes, have that continuous improvement, be able to limit losses and waste, help improve some logistical issues. But for the benefits for us today, really, we sit in the building practitioners as the designers and installers. Digital traceability has huge potential for us to have greater certainty to your regulatory compliance, and that's attaching the attribute data to the product, so you know at that point of specification or installation that you've got that certainty of the information, it's there with the product. So improves your ability to be able greater certainty to do contractual obligations at the same time, having that information. You can have greater efficiencies with your data entry, that things can be scanned in and out more readily, reducing the opportunity for errors and delays in the process, supporting your appropriate product substitution, which is always one of those challenging areas that I know us builders are getting accused of cutting some corners on. But if you're making some decisions there, or you need to make some decisions there, you've got the information to do that. And it is harder to cut those corners, but also easier to make those appropriate substitutions. And at the same time, being able to better use new innovative products, because you've got the information there to hand that you can trust and make those decisions, make those informed decisions. The one that sticks in my mind, and it's always from this whole process, a builder saying, I just need to know that what was delivered to site is what was specified. It really seems a simple request on the surface, but if we can improve our digital traceability, we know that what comes to site is actually what was specified. Improving information, we can prevent expensive disputes, and we can reach that point of building sign-off more quickly if we know exactly what it is that has come into our buildings and that it is all conforming, complying, fit for use, fit for purpose products. The benefits go through to the building owners in helping them to do the maintenance and ultimately the reuse in the building if they've got better information. We think for government that they've got some carriage around improving productivity and quality and safety, can help meet those goals and those objectives that they've got. And the product certification and compliance providers, these are our partners in the NATAs and JASANs, can improve the value of the certification and the reputation that they provide, because their information is that it's more certain that the information they provided is the information that the end users are working on. So a lot of opportunities there and a lot of benefits. So how does digital traceability work? What do we need to be able to achieve this great world? We need to have some common building blocks, and apologise for my rather cheesy graphics, but to get that information moving through that whole supply chain from that very beginning of a product inception through to the end use of the building and then looping back around, we have to be able to share information in a consistent way, so that we can all build our own piece, because we're never going to have some magical we're never going to have some monolithic system. We all need to build our own traceability systems in our own part of the supply chain. But if we can do it from some shared building blocks, it means as it leaves one part of the supply chain and comes into the next, these two systems can talk to each other and then the information can flow through. So that's the key of what we've done with our implementation guide is, well, let's, as collective industries, let's decide on what that looks like and what are those shared building blocks, so that I can confidently, in my part of the industry, go forth and build my traceability systems, knowing that it can receive information and then send information out through the supply chain. So first up, that means some shared principles, some common data conventions, some shared information or data templates. What is the information that we're sending through the supply chain? How do we ensure that we can trust that information, which is those verifiable credentials that Neil was going through? And then, of course, our industry tools that we're all really familiar with, such as BIM. How can we use them and work in with them? So first up, the shared principles. To start off with, at a basic level, we need to set about building our traceability systems off some shared principles. And that starts with how can we be outcome-based? We want all our systems to ensure that we've got data collection and sharing that is meaningful, timely, complete, and accurate. Needs to be trustworthy and verifiable. We need to be able to build trust and credibility, improving our customer and consumer confidence. We need to have a system that's transparent, improves the visibility of product information at key decision-making points. That's so you know that you've got the information there when you're making your decisions. But at the same time, secure and private. The constant thing is the manufacturers not sharing test reports, certifiers, building surveyors, specifiers not having enough information to know that they can trust the information. So how do we achieve that balance between both transparent and secure and private? And digital traceability can allow you to do that. Interoperable and technology agnostic. So that's what I was saying earlier, that it needs to be able to, the systems that we build need to be able to receive information from other systems and then send it out down the chain, down the supply chain. So how do we use technology and data neutral conventions so that the information can flow through? We don't need proprietary systems where the information gets stuck. It needs to be comprehensive in scope. we need a system that looks to the entire supply chain, but also the breadth of the supply chain. So we don't need a separate system and a different way of working for timber, for steel, for windows. We need to be able to have systems that can pull that together and link it all through. And of course, continuously improving. So from those principles, we have some common data conventions that we need to be looking at. And this is where the coalition partner in GS1, who's a global global standards data organisation, they write the standards for the QR codes, the barcodes that you see at the grocery store. All the different standards that can help you uniquely identify who's in the supply chain, where it's been, where it's going to, and how you can break up products as it goes through the shipments chain. So all those standards, you need those unique identifiers, and all those standards exist with GS1. Common classifications is another space that I think we probably need some more work on, but we have some common classifications with Uniclass and ETEM as two. Standards Australia is looking at this space too. Again, if we're going to have information moving through our supply chains, we need to talk about it in a common way and group it in a common way, and we'll need to work through how we can do that better. And then the next part of our building blocks is the data template. And this, for me, is the really powerful part for us on as building practitioners and our supply chain side, is what is the basic common information that we need to have on building products that moves through the supply chain. We need to know, and this, if you're familiar with the product technical statement from the evidence of suitability that sits there now, we started with that. How can we talk about what the product is, where can you use it, where can't you use it, what's its limitations of use, and where's the evidence to back that up, and where do I go to get more information? In a nutshell, is the basic information that we think should always be accompanying every product as it moves through the supply chain. So we've taken that, and in the interest of creating these building blocks, how do we talk about that in a way that can be used consistently throughout the supply chain? And then, so this is just a screenshot. Sorry, it's a much longer table, and I really recommend that you go to the guide and see the full list, and we'd love your feedback on whether we've got it right. Of course, there is additional level of detail that would, for product specific, if you need to know some detail on your steel or your timber, for example, but this is starting at those first level. This is the generic information we should have on all building products all the time. And then expanding that, as now we're moving into the environmental and social performance, we're starting to map out, well, what is the key information that we need to know about every building product to start to inform what we need to know on your environmental and social performance. And I'd say that this part is still quite new to us, and probably a space that will evolve a lot over the coming years. And again, it'd be something that if we could use a collective brains trust to map out what this data template looks like and communicate that quite clearly up the supply chain to our manufacturers and suppliers and those building regulators, to that whole ecosystem. So there's a lot of work underway in the space of digital traceability, and you'll hear more from Andrew coming up next. There's a supply chain modernisation project in Victoria with the level crossings that have done some exciting stuff that I'm really looking forward to learning more about the results of that. Timber's doing chain of custody certification. There's a National Traceability Advisory Group organised by GS1 that is learning lots and sharing a lot of information. There's a lot of work going on in the Building 4.0 CRC that will be interesting to see how that comes out. But what we've seen most recently, and as Neil was telling us, is this registration scheme proposal from the Australian Building Codes Board. And what's while it is very high level and early days in that process, it's really encouraging to see that they have picked up some of what we've talked about in that data integrity, that you can trust the information, those principles I was talking about, the interoperability, global connectivity and transparency, and traceability has been a big priority for them, or a priority for them in that paper. How it all works in practice, I don't think they've got that level of detail yet, but that's where the coalition now, and I think our industries collectively, need to weigh in and see how we can influence this process and try to give them the next level of detail that they need to have a system that works for us, so that we can have confidence in our building product information and being able to work towards digital traceability. So just to highlight in that, the ABCB next Monday is having a webinar or an information session on this scheme, and that submissions close on the 3rd of October. And that will definitely be something that the National Building Products Coalition will be focusing on getting done, and having a submission on, or we'll probably all have our own submissions, but maybe collectively as well. So where to next? If this all sounds like it's something that's interesting to you and that you'd like to support, we'd love you to put your hand up and join the pledge and say, yes, you want to be part of it. The pledge is on our website, and it talks to those 6 principles, those high-level principles of what digital traceability needs to look like for our industries. And we have both a LinkedIn group and a web page that you can access there, and you can reach out to us anytime if you've got some thoughts, some ideas, some suggestions for where to next. But I think our immediate focus is going to be on that registration scheme, and then how we can perhaps turn our mind back to some of the other of those 5 elements that we haven't delved into yet. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Diane. That was a very informative presentation. We now follow with a case study from Dr. Andrew Wheeler, Executive Director of the Australasian Certification Authority for Reinforcing and Structural Steel, ACRS. Andrew's presentation is focused on digital verification and traceability. Traceability is a key part of conformity assessment and has been an integral part of compliance schemes such as the ACRS scheme for structural and reinforcing steels. With increasing demand for the golden thread of traceability in building products and evolution of international traceability digital protocols, a system-agnostic approach for product traceability is being developed in alignment with the UN Transparency Protocol for Global Trade. This system is applicable for all building products and has the potential to provide transparency through the entire manufacturing process. ACRS has been moving forward with the digital rollout within the construction industry with the introduction of digital certificates. The next step has been the introduction of systemic agnostic digital credentials on product labels. This enables people using open source protocols to validate claims regarding the product. Focusing on our small part of the building product ecosystem, ACRS can now demonstrate how third-party software systems are able to scan particular product labels and verify the authenticity of the certification for that particular batch. These protocols are open source and designed to be implemented within or alongside existing systems for transferring digital data. And I hand over to you, Andrew.
It's a pleasure to talk to you this afternoon and give a presentation of where we're at. So ACRS is the Australasian Certifying Authority for Reinforcing and Structural Steels. So we're a third-party certifier, Jazz Hands accredited, and our main focus is with respect to the certification of steel to ensure that it actually is compliant with the Australian standards. We work in, and when we start talking about traceability, I think traceability is not a new element. There's a number of industries around the world where traceability is critical. If we look at the food industry, the automotive industry, or even the textile industry, traceability is an important part there. When we look at the the construction industry, we're looking at an exchange between a buyer and a supplier. So we've got our buyer and suppliers there. The buyer's got some demands. There's the consumer demands. There's government regulations they've got to meet, and there's ESG reporting as well. The suppliers then have to actually work out, okay, what are the demands? What sort of information do we have to share? And the suppliers are also faced now with an increasing demand for information. So we've got the information, the buyers passing that across to the suppliers, and the suppliers passing the information back. And that could be about quality of product, compliance, or there is other requirements such as ESG. On top of that, we've got industry associations such as the master builders. There are other ones around. We talk about the Glass and Aluminium Association, the Steel Reinforcing, the Australian Institute of Steel. So a number of associations who are acting between the buyers and suppliers, and they're developing policies and actually supporting the transaction between these two organisations. But on top of that, what we have is organisations who are basically trust marks, or developing a trust between the suppliers and the buyers. They typically are third-party organisations, and we've just got a few named up there, being the ACRES for Steel Certification. We've got the Marine Stewardship Council, no deforestation. So there are a number of organisations who actually provide trust in the products and going forward. So when the buyer's actually purchasing a product, they're saying, okay, what's required? Is it going to be fit for purpose? Is it going to be compliant? And in a number of situations, you'll also find there are other specifications that the buyer wants to meet a given criteria for the particular project. So how is this compliance demonstrated? There are a number of different ways. If it meets the standard, there could be a code mark, which is a requirement which can be used under the NCC or the third-party assessments, or we can go to an expert opinion. But what we have is quite a complex supply chain, and we need to consider that and moving forward. For steel, for example, when you're looking at compliance for a steel product, there's a number of different standards. And when you're actually checking for compliance, the person who's doing that checking actually needs to go through and check a number of these standards and say, are we still compliant? One of the requirements in the steel standards is actually to provide a mill test certificate. Here's a nice typical mill certificate, which was provided with a batch of steel. Everything looked good. It was a falsified certificate. So the end user here actually picked up, it was around 300 tonne of steel. He's then having some issues with it, and he's gone back and actually checked the certificates, and the certificates were actually falsified. And it wasn't falsified by the mill, it was actually falsified along the supply chain. So there's issues with false certificates being introduced in the supply chain. ACRES, been around for a while. They recognise this a body who certifies steel, which is good. It means we're a target for certificates as well. So a number of certificates floated around the beginning of this year for ACRES certificates. And it's interesting to note that one was actually issued before the given date. There's a number of fake certificates out there. Now, we talk about big companies and things like that. Kobe, which is Japan's third largest steelmaker, a number of years ago actually admitted to 5 decades or a number of decades of falsifying test reports, which had long-standing effects on the industry, trying to work out where the product had gone and whether there are issues there. So the supply chain was thrown into turmoil and significant costs there and significant loss in trust. It's not just confined to the steel industry. We all remember Dieselgate, where we were able to teach a car to cheat the test. This had consequences running down to a number of other auto manufacturers who were actually using the particular items. So there's significant fraudulent activity happening out there, and we need to be active in trying to stop that. So how do we get the confidence? There's a number of different ways of looking at providing confidence. There's first party, so we can trust what the manufacturer is saying. We've then got second party, so we can go through and say, okay, let's do a few checks and check to see whether the trust is there. Or we can go through to third party. So you're getting a third party coming in and actually looking at the product. And that provides you at differing levels of trust, but where can we go from that? Another way of ensuring we're actually getting a bit more confidence there is actually going through a certified third-party company, certified by JASANS. So JASANS can certify for management systems, what they can actually do for product certification. The two are very different, and it's important to remember that JASANs actually provide accreditation, so they don't certify the product, but what they do is they actually certify the organisations who are actually certifying the product, or they accredit the certification bodies who are certifying the products. So they're not doing the certification there, but they're accrediting the certifiers. NATA gets thrown around a little bit too there, and NATA is also a way of providing confidence, but the NATA accreditation is actually looking at particular tests or test reports. So there's actually tests being done on particular items. So they provide test certificates, and they're undertaking tests. A NATA accredited laboratory actually goes through audits, so you can have good confidence in that lab is actually providing good results, which are measurable and benchmarked across the industry. But it's important to remember, I think, particularly once you start talking about products, is that a test report is not third-party certification. What it's actually doing is basically stating that a prototype sent to a laboratory passed testing on that day, but there's no guarantee that the product is what the factory will continue to supply. So that's something to remember, that a test report is a report on a particular item. So when we start looking at product certification, I think that it's important to remember that there are actually different. There's a lot of different products out there. Their importance and how they're applied varies significantly, and that should be considered when we're talking about product certification as well. We would need to consider the cost of replacing a product, or if it does fail, how much is it going to cost to replace it? What we see also is that product certification, that there is no standard no standard code for how a product should be certified, and it's up to the various certification bodies to actually come up with that. We do have the Australian International Standards for outlining test requirements. So standards, a number of the standards actually do have written into them what are the test requirements for this particular product, and that is good for us as steel certifiers, because material standards sort of outline what tests are required. But it's important to remember that schemes are developed by either a regulatory authority or a certifying body. Just an example there, the code mark or watermark, they're both being developed by the ABCB, and they're to a certain level. Whereas the ACRES scheme, or the 5 ticks for a certified product, which is released by the old SAA Global, is another scheme, and both those schemes have their own rules, and they are different. So it's important to remember that the schemes are different and need to look into what is actually happening there. Just to expand that a little bit more, I think certified bodies fall into, I would consider fall into 4 different categories. And you can look at a product, a certified firm who has actually got third-party certification. And the third-party certification will say that the producers have the facility to produce the required product of the required quality. The next level is the producers have the facility to produce the required quality, and at the time of the audit, this has been verified. And then you look at other producers who have the facilities to produce the required quality, and they're regularly audited and verified. And the top level, or the level 4 there, is the producers have the facilities to produce the required quality. They're regularly audited by auditors with technical expertise in the field and carry out independent testing. So as you can see, there's a number of different types of certification, which can be classified as third-party certification, and that varies depending on what products you're looking at. Just an example here, we've got a stool. So yes, that stool can be certified by a third party, or it can be first-party certified, depending on what you want. But you look at the stool there and say, okay, what are the implications of failure there? Well, the implications of failure is, well, you can take it back to the shop where you got it from. The costs of replacing are not significant. So the level of certification you want there is probably lower than what you would have for a bridge bearing. And you can see a bridge bearing there. Now, in this case, bridge bearings for a lot of the road authorities are actually go to a third party for the certification, and they're actually tested as well. And they're tested by a IANS or a NATA laboratory. So the level of testing is there, and the auditing required is actually at a much higher level, because the cost to replace these, or the cost of a failure, is significant. Just a third example there on the right is doors. Now, doors may vary. If you're looking at a partition door, the cost to replace that is not high, and the consequence of failure is not significant. But then if you start looking at a fire door, well, then the cost of a failure in a fire door and a critical component at a critical time can be significant and have a detrimental effect on the building and its performance under fire conditions. So the level of certification will vary depending on the product. So if we look at product certification, what do we need to look for? I think it's these, when we start looking at product certification, these 5 points are things that we should be focused on to see what's happening. Firstly, is the independence. Who's the driver of the scheme? Is the scheme actually being driven by the supplier, or is it being driven by the customer? The supplier wants to sell a product, the customer actually wants a product which is going to perform, and in case of structural critical elements, perform safely. The relevance. I did mention product certification or management schemes. There is a very big difference between a product certification and a management scheme. So if someone says they've got a product certified to 9001, I would be questioning that, because 9001 is about management. And when you're looking at a product, you want to make sure it's actually the performance requirements are being checked. The regularity of the audits and the rigor of the audits is also an important one. How often are the audits occur on an annual basis, biannual basis, or are they actually occurring every 5 years? And the audit staff, do they have the expertise? Do they go in and know what they're looking at? Or are they just going through and looking at a set of rules and saying, yes, you're following the set of rules there? Knowing the processes and how things are being made is very important for products to ensure you're actually getting a conforming product. Demonstration of conformance. How frequent is testing? Is the testing independent? Are the tests being externally reviewed? I did come across a facility that was being tested, was being certified, and I said, oh, did the certifier look at your test? And they said, no, they just asked if we were doing the testing. So to me, that's sort of questioning how rigorous is that actually scheme. And the last one is the traceability, which we're talking about here. And traceability is very much an important part of product certification, and ensuring that we actually are getting the product that we're looking for. Traceability has been around in steels for a long time, and that's been an important part of the ACRES scheme, is actually ensuring the traceability. So it's the ability to discover the information about where and how a product was made. Traceability has got to be maintained throughout the manufacturer supply. As I said, it's a requirement of a number of standards, and it's increasingly important to consider when we start talking about ESGs. Knowing where your product comes from is very important to actually understand what its carbon footprint is, and what its impact on the environment actually is. Here's a couple of examples there. So we get some coil. The coils come in from a supplier. It's got a tag. In this case here, the receiver of the goods actually re-tags that, so they've got their own system. They then process it, and as it's going through the process system, they're actually keeping a track of what's being manufactured and what products being used for those manufactured. And when it goes out, it's going out with a tag, which actually has a QR code on it, so it can be traced right to the site, so they know where the product goes. And if a purchaser wanted to know where the original product come from, he can actually go back to the supplier, and they can trace the material back to the original supplier or the mill. And that's part of the requirements that we look at when we're actually doing our audit for ACRES, is going through and ensure that traceability is maintained there. So looking at having confidence in compliance. I mean, I've just talked about, we've got fake certificates, there's fake credentials out there. There's inappropriate schemes. So how do we know what we're getting? And I think to progress forward, I think this is where the digital certification is really coming into its own. For certification, but also I think it's very advantageous for once we start talking about environmental requirements, because we are tracing the product and we know where it's coming from. But when we start talking about digital certification, there's a couple of terms there which will be thrown around, and it's worthwhile just touching on what they are. So we've got the verifiable credentials there and a trust anchor. They all sound complicated, but I think verifiable credentials we know a little bit about. In New South Wales, to go on a work site, you actually need a white card. To get the white card, me being the holder, I've got that white card. I actually have to go to a firm and do a course, and they issue the white card. That white card is then issued to the authority. So in this case here, it's New South Wales government. They give me on my app, on my phone, there's a little app there where I can actually pull up the white card. It's got a QR code there. Issued. They can actually verify. I can then scan that QR code. It goes back to the issuer and checks to see whether that is actually a valid code. So, yeah, I'm carrying it around with me, but when I go to a website, go onto a work site, they can actually verify that this credential is actually a valid credential in real time. Trust anchors. Another one is trust anchor is knowing you're going to a spot which can be trusted. Now we all know about two-factor authentication. So we log in somewhere, we use a username, password, and then we have to authenticate through a trust anchor, so to speak. Now that could be through an app or receiving a text code to your phone. That's being used more and more these days. And even to the other day, I actually had to go through an app and a text code, so it's getting worse. In the steel industry, verification and traceability has been a requirement all along. So we've got our certificates, and we've actually got the tags that you have to go through and check to make sure the product's there. The ACRE scheme is a trusted and rigorous scheme. We go through, we're actually certified to 17065, which is the code for that. The scheme is actually endorsed by JASANS, and ACRES are actually a JASANS accredited body. Now, we've just rolled out in the last year what we call the ACRES Cloud. So we're actually moving all this information that we've had on paper form, and we're actually moving into the cloud, enabling people to get real-time verifiable credentials. So this is steel industry is a very small part of the construction industry, and us verifying product is also a small part, but we're just working on a small part. And enabling us to actually go through and verify the products. So an example of that is here. We've got a certificate here. So on top of all our certificates now, we have a QR code. I showed you a bit earlier some certificates that were fraudulent. Now, if you've got a certificate, you've got a QR code on it. You've used the ACRES Cloud, which is a downloadable app from the web for either an iPhone or the Android. You press the little blue button down there, which is validate the ACRES certificate. It will then go off to the cloud, the ACRES Cloud, and say, okay, for that particular certificate, we've found its best bar, and they've got either a bar processing or fabric manufacturing, and you can actually then get information about the product to the extent where you can actually get the labels, or for a reinforcing bar, it'll actually show you the marks that should be on the bar. So you can actually confirm with a real-time app that the product you're getting matches the certificate they've actually provided with you. We're now just rolling out the next level, which is looking at the ACRES Cloud for batch verification. So this is a couple of examples there. So what we're looking at is on the tag, there'll be a certificate, a QR code for the certificate. So you can go through and actually get the certificate. And you can see there, we go through and we get the certificate for this ABC steel. Or we can actually scan the mill label there with the little yellow on in the ACRES Cloud. That'll then scan, you can see there, scans the QR code there. We've got a little green box around the QR code. It then comes back and says that particular batch there is actually got a mill certificate and it's been ACRES certified. So it's actually saying that particular batch of material you've received has the ACRES certification and it matches the particular certificate. So it's going through and checking down to a batch level that the products are compliant. So what we're doing is we're not doing anything different in a sense. We're looking at a verifiable credential, which is going through and actually providing a digital certificate on what is already there for a printed certificate, and that can be passed down the line. So now that's for the ACRES system, and it's very much focused on ACRES actually being able to have confidence in their certificates and us have confidence that the product is being supplied down the line and is validated. So that's an internal app. So what we're talking about, and Graham's talking about, is a system which is a bit more generic and can actually be used by anybody to actually verify a particular product. So what we've done, our next step, so we've got the ACRES cloud, which is running. The next step is actually going a step further to actually provide some verifiable credentials, which can be checked using a generic system. And the example here is this system can actually be bolted on to existing technology, so to speak. So we've developed the ACRES cloud, and now we're actually bolting on this system, so you can actually go through and actually check using generic systems that everybody can access to actually check to see whether a product is still certified or has been certified. So all we're doing is going through and actually replacing what happens currently using paper certificates, but we're going through and actually starting to use digital certificates for that. So what we're doing is we're relying on the system we've already had, or you're talking about, but in this case here, we're enabling the suppliers to actually provide information back to the buyers directly through digital means and means that can be verified and trusted. The system we've rolled out meets the requirements that for the UN CFAC. It's using the World Wide Web, so it's the whole system that the couple of papers there that Neil referenced earlier regarding traceability. So it's looking at the international processes, so that this system can be used and rolled out internationally and move forward. So just a quick rundown on how it works. In steel, we may have a number of processors or suppliers who will supply product. They'll have the certification. They'll have steel certification. They then supply the product to a processor. So the processor is actually to take products from the top line steel and from quality steel and manufacture an item for a site. So they buy the steel is supplied to them. The construction project actually has a particular requirement. The steel can go straight to them, or it can go to the processor. The processor manufactures the product, and then it's shipped across the construction project. Now, that's for the steel. But what we can also say is the concrete can have the same sort of system, and they can actually provide the data as well. Timber, windows, they can all provide that information, and using this protocol, you can actually scan it, and you can actually go back and you can get the information you need regarding traceability. It could be the product passports, the ESG data. So it's up to the processors or the manufacturers actually to provide that information on the product labels, tying back to a verifiable credential for somebody such as ACRES. So that's the system outlined, and it's given us the product there. So really what we're looking at is we have a system where we're looking at static codes for the certificates. We're looking at dynamic codes which are provided for each batch. So each batch has its own certificate. We're providing a link and an ID resolver so you can actually go through and check the requirements back to ACRES, or the manufacturer can actually check going back through ACRES to ensure they're actually getting a product and they can actually validate that the product is verified. So I don't know if you can actually see the screen there, but what we've got there is a QR code. So this is more hands-on. So if you want to try scanning that QR code, that'll take you to a website. You pick up on that website, and then you can actually scan the GTIM below there from that website, but you do have to allow access to your camera for that. So that way you can actually go through it as an example of how it's actually working for a particular product, the example I went through. So I can give you a chance to look at that. And what we see when we go there, you can actually see, you'll see what the verifiable credential, and you can work your way through and actually work out what the particular product is certified to, who's actually certified it, the traceability, so who's actually transformed the product. So you can get all the information about in this case, it's a pile cage. So you can actually say the pile cage, you can get the sustainability requirements, you can actually understand who's made it, where it's come from, and you can actually also see the material that's going to it as well. So that's just an example of how we rolled it out. So the ACRES cloud is actually rolling out the product, and we've been able to put this traceability capability on the top of it, so that anybody can actually write the code to actually read these particular programs or the QR codes and actually go back to the sources of where they're coming from to get the verification of the product. And I think I've finished there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was very comprehensive, and it's certainly alarming to see the amount of fraudulent data out in the marketplace and the need for a traceability framework. And I want to thank everyone for attending today's session and all your questions and the discussion in the chat. And we encourage all of you to visit NBPC's webpage and LinkedIn page, read the Traceability and Digitalisation of Building Product Information Implementation Guide, get your organisation behind the efforts to improve traceability by signing the pledge, and get in touch with any follow-up questions. Thank you to ASBN and Ken Long for hosting, all the speakers and panelists, and to all of you for being part of the conversation toward influencing positive change in our industry. It's been a real pleasure to be part of it, so thank you.